So our second panel has an admittedly slightly tongue-in-cheek title of Declaring Victory. We don't really imagine this moment when the world will be able to say, all right, we've eradicated coastal challenges, we've achieved this ideal state of nature, we're moving on to colonizing Mars or conquering cancer. So to start off, I asked Buck and Lynn and Len to each spend 2 or 3 minutes just reflecting on for them. So what does it mean in the world of coastal restoration to declare victory, or more generally to achieve success? And how do we integrate within these concepts of success some of this ecosystem ecology and the local economies and communities that we were hearing about in panel 1? I guess we can just go in order if we want.
Thank you. Well, first of all, I just want to say that after listening to that last panel, I basically eliminated 95% of my notes. So all I can say basically is ibid. I will say that I've been very fortunate, quite frankly, to be able to take a lot of the ideas and concepts that we've been talking about so far, but to work on a thing that we worked collectively on called the Habitat Blueprint, which really was looking at some real, some concepts of organizing principles, I guess, on how you could think about, in the event that we had such an opportunity to do ecological restoration, how would you think about it? And then coming to the council and finding a very receptive group of 6 federal agencies and 5 states that wanted to do things somewhat differently. And so in the past year, we re-examined our comprehensive plan and really based that plan on these kind of commitments. Looking at things like collaboration, best available science, and the nice thing, if you want to call it nice, we do have a fair amount of money. So in the Restore Council, somewhere around $3 billion. Now, looking at the scale, though, and talking about scale, which we heard a lot about, the Louisiana Master Plan in and of itself is a $50 billion to $100 billion plan, an excellent plan. But it goes to show that if you only have, if you have challenges like a hypoxic zone, or if you have the largest loss of wetland, you need the resource to do them. And even with all this resources, still not even on that same relative scale. So we have to realize that we have to make good collaborative decisions that are based on good and best available science, and how we can be smart about that and put them in that context. Incumbent upon those same commitments is a kind of communication. And who are we getting advice from? Are we just looking to each other? And so we've come up also with a way of providing some resources to meet those commitments. And part of that plan over the next few years, and this is why I do feel somewhat optimistic, is that we are trying to take a different approach by basing all these things. And then over the next 15 years that this money comes, unlike appropriated dollars, we do know that we're going to have X amount of money over the next few years, and that we have a reason to partner with NIFWIF. We have a reason to partner with NERDA. We have a reason to talk to the local communities about things as we move forward, and really put adaptive management to work in a way that makes sense. And so I think it's really an exciting opportunity, and that we can really put into practice, and we have that platform to do that.
Yeah, so I am going to bring, and I'm going to announce it so you won't have to guess, the lens of a recovering public official and a political scientist. And let me situate the question even of what is success and suggest, as others have implied, there's no fixed endpoint. I think thinking about what success looks like really is a framing that this is a journey, not a destination. And if you think just of the context, that becomes self-evident. Knowledge itself is dynamic. New knowledge illuminates new solutions and new, better worlds. The physical world is dynamic, as the previous speakers noted, and particularly dynamic with the changing climate. Community priorities are dynamic, and they are very much a part of understanding what success is. So I think when one considers the question, what is success, it's more useful to think about it as a set of decision characteristics. And I want to mention 6. I think all of these came up in one way or another by the previous panelists. But first is obviously that systems focus. There are multiple values at play when one thinks about resilience. And so the challenge is one of optimizing across values, not maximizing a single value. And of course, within that context, one faces the challenges of how do you describe your objectives when they are not unidimensional. Second, and I think Don Bosch alluded to this, these are we need to be thinking of success with a forward focus, not a backward replication. The world has changed. If you look at the Everglades right now, and I was deeply involved during my time at Interior in Everglades restoration, the area we have to work with there is about a third of what the original size of the Everglades was. So even where we are focusing on restoration, there has been so much transformation, so much built environment that replicating the past is really not feasible. Third is the issue of scale. We've heard a lot of folks discussing that. Scale commensurate with the functionality of ecosystems, but also of community needs and economic opportunities. Fourth, and here's that political science hat, we touched upon it a little bit in the previous panel, but I want to emphasize how incredibly fundamental it is. And that is, there are very significant governance challenges to advance a systems focus, action at relevant scales, the time horizons that were talked about, and by the way, the participatory engagement that yields not only a reflection of what communities want, what their priorities are, but a sense of credibility and legitimacy. And so that implies that we need cross-agency, multi-jurisdictional, public-private collaborative processes. We need the nimbleness that Congressman Graves described. But governance are really key challenges, and I don't think any vision of success can really direct where we need to go without thinking seriously about how one transcends some of those governance challenges. Then there's the people factor, and we heard this in the Q&A just now, but also in some of the comments. You know, we do need robust collaboration. Success is not my vision. Success is not the vision of the previous panelists. It's not the vision of a number of scientists who have looked at systems and so on. Success really is what are the suite of priorities that people have? What are the values they hold? What are the economic, the environmental, and the social considerations? And how do people themselves participate in exploring what those outcomes are that we want? But by the way, it's not just what priorities are and what those outcomes might be, but you know what? There's an awful lot of experiential knowledge. People on the ground that live in places, know their jobs, know the constraints of their jobs, that help pinpoint the possible and actually inform solutions. And then my sixth characteristic is another one that has been mentioned in the previous panel, and that is the incredible need for monitoring, adjustment, learning, dynamic adaptive management. We heard Don talk about that. We heard Holly talk about that. In a dynamic world, success is not that end point. It is, in many respects, constant iteration and adjustment through learning.
So I heard a lot already. I was tempted to just try to react to everything I've heard so far, but I'm going to avoid that temptation. Words matter. I'm going to start with that. Coastal resilience is not the same thing as restoration, although restoration can be part of coastal resilience. In fact, I think the word restoration needs to be rethought entirely, and I think we heard that in the early panel. It already is being rethought. And in terms of, it will be replaced by words like natural and nature-based features and so forth, trying to think in terms of that, which really means re-engineering the system in terms of some desired human outcome. But the problem is that we already have a term that defines success and restoration, and it's in our brains or it's in our subtext, and it's this term ecological health. What is ecological health when you start looking at it as an operative term, whether it's in the Chesapeake Bay or other places? It's representing a state of nature that is like it used to be in the past before human beings showed up and screwed things up. That's what the term is. And the term restoration is very much organized around creating some idyllic past that was not necessarily pre-Columbian, but it might have been only 50 years ago. But it was some time in the past where before people got in the way, we had a better state of the environment. And so what you wind up with is this idea of striking a balance. There's the ecosystem that could be better, and there's these people that are in the way. And so you have this trade-off to be made between the human footprint and the ecology. So I want to come back to that point, but I think we've already agreed as a group that that's a really not a very useful way to think about what the word restoration means. But I'm going to argue, and I think we need to think about it, that it's still there. It's still in our mental state, and most importantly, it's in most of our laws. So that's point number one. Point number two, when we look at this balance question, whether it calls for walls or wetlands or retreat, there's a strong premise in most all the discussions that the federal taxpayers are going to foot the bill, not only for restoration, but for storm and risk reduction. Congressman Graves' point about duplication of benefits was nothing more than a way to say, I want the federal government to pay for everything. Let's take the hazard mitigation grant program and let's use it to cost share the core project, and then the state of Louisiana doesn't have to pay a thing. Federal dollars are the way we always talk about getting these projects done. So anyway, in that context, I've been thinking a little bit about these hurricanes and thinking beyond Louisiana and where we're going to be in 20 or 30 years. So we already have this idea about sea level rise and storms changing and lots of things going on. And so the idea that we're going to have this future baseline that's sort of static or like it used to be, or that we can then manage against and go back to some past, I think that's going to be gone. But meanwhile, at the same time, as we look, that will disappear. But if we look out a little bit in time and think more broadly than Louisiana, I think that what we're seeing is an increasing shift toward thinking about protecting and redirecting human occupancy of the coast. And I think that's going to be the driver of what we do in coastal management, which brings me to the taxpayer again. I think the nation's taxpayers, this is the way I'm thinking about it, will only be willing and able to pay for human adaptation to changing coastal conditions. Now, in some locations, that's going to mean federal taxpayers. Adaptation is going to mean walls. It's going to mean reducing hazard, exposure, vulnerability, maybe a few natural and nature-based features. And where's that going to go? Where are those federal dollars going? New York City, Miami, Charleston, you get the idea, okay? But in other locations, and maybe some pockets inside population concentration, adaptation is going to be getting out of the way, moving. Now, I'm skeptical, unfortunately, that federal money is going to go to help people move. It's probably going to go to build stuff. I hope those less well-off in society, but it's not the case now, are going to get help in relocating. But I don't see that necessarily coming today. Now, with respect to ecological management, which is the term I'm going to use to substitute for restoration, there's going to be a bunch of abandoned areas. And my guess is that they're going to be reclaimed by natural coastal processes. They're going to self-design. We're not going to spend a lot of money going in and trying to tweak. There will be some dollars that will go in and say, well, this isn't quite giving us the outcome we wanted here, so we'll tweak a little here, we'll tweak a little there. But there's going to be a lot of self-design that's going to be the story of the coast when we think about the environmental piece in the future. So we will make some modest interventions, but again, I don't think the federal treasury is going to be putting a lot of money into redirecting with the self-design process. So anyway, I'll end there. I hope I'm wrong about sea level and storms, and I hope I'm wrong about the federal taxpayer, but I think we better talk about it.
So just want to make sure that I'm hearing what you said. So in your mind, a kind of 50 or, I don't know, I need to put years on it, from now, kind of vision of the coast is a combination of the sea level rise and the storms is just going to result in fairly massive population shifts potentially away from the coast and a kind of rewilding almost of certain areas.
I think it's a scenario worth discussing in terms of jumping out to the future. Yes, and I think that one of the barriers to that will be a reluctance on the part of the nation to admit that some areas need to get more protection and some areas need to move on. And I think that there's going to be, and that stickiness will be whatever stands in the way of the way you've just described it. I say that would be success, and I think there's going to be a stickiness in terms of the reluctance of the society to come to grips with that reality that will stand in the way of success.
So, Lynn and Buck, do you want to react to that as a vision of societal success in the coastal zone?
Well, I'll react in several ways. There's no question in my mind when we look at projections of sea level rise, even under rather modest scenarios, that there are already and will be places that, with any sort of objective look, would seem unsustainable. We heard the example of the home that had been flooded, I don't know, 50 times or something. Clearly, to just rebuild and rebuild and rebuild in places that are vulnerable, not once every 100 years from a high intensity storm with significant storm surge and so forth, but every couple years, really does imply a need to rethink some of the spatial distribution of people. But I think the questions are severalfold. One, to what extent, what does that world look like, and to what extent are there massive needs for relocation versus relatively more modest? Because that changes the nature of the problem set. Secondly, I think Lynn is absolutely right, though, even if there are some areas that just seem not sustainable. The question then becomes, first of all, how is it that one engages with communities themselves so that they help articulate their own futures? So we've seen a little bit of that. We've seen a relocation of a couple communities, one out in California, one along the, in the Mississippi watershed. We've seen a little bit of it, very small relative to the potential need over time. But the question is, how does one engage those communities in that thinking? And then there's the question of who does pay for that. And that's a nut I can't crack. I will say that to the degree that we are expending money post-disaster, doing so in a way that is simply retrospective and rebuilding seems to me to be a misuse or a potential misuse of the money we do have. So the fact is, we are spending millions, billions of dollars. Now we can expend those in same old ways, or we can be asking ourselves the resilience question and seeing if we can't divert some of that. And there are laws and statutes that actually impede that, so that is an important thing to look at.
So when he was talking about that, what really came to my mind was that movie Groundhog Day. No matter how much you change, it seems like we always end up making the same things. And I think unfortunately, a lot of the laws that we're operating on kind of force us back into that kind of same old thinking. We've seen restoration programs around the country that have the greatest of intentions, but end up sort of doing these and I know that people are probably tired of hearing me say this, but these sort of random acts of restoration that, really kind of deal with the, okay, we've calmed this guy down, we've calmed this, so everybody's got the low-hanging fruit. But what we don't do, we haven't really learned anything. We heard a lot about that from the previous group. And one of my hopes, quite frankly, in the Restore Act and really all the BP money, and I've talked to other folks that are dealing with the NERDA and the NIFWIF folks, is that because this is not appropriated money, so this is not the taxpayers paying for it, but can we use our thinking? Can we think in a resilient and a sustainable way in the products that we do, to thinking along the terms of how an ecosystem functions, that really changes how decisions are being made. So that we can use this as a model, say, well, we don't have to think the same old way. Again, we are also guided by the same rules and regulations that everybody else are. But one of the things that we do have, and we've been using, I think, in a unique kind of way, is using different members' environmental compliance regulations, whether it's a programmatic EIS or whether it's other types of NEPA or other regulatory aspects to help, sort of almost to take the lessons learned from one place and apply them to somewhere else. And I think that has been that's going to be our biggest challenge, quite frankly, is overcoming that inertia of the same old thinking, and quite frankly, thinking about how are we going to spend this money in a way that is not gone in 10 years from now, or 15 years from now. Can we really think about having a real another cliche, but a paradigm shift in how we think about this? And I hate to, I see people already laughing about it because it, overused phrase. But I think in this particular case, I think we have that opportunity. Now the question is whether we're going to take advantage of it, and I think that's where the communication and our ability to communicate science to the decision makers, but also to the people who are going to hold us accountable, are going to be a huge, huge, huge aspect of our success. And I'm hopeful that we have created a framework to do that, but that's going to be incumbent upon all of us to make that happen.
Just following up for a moment on the word accountability that you used, and something that we heard from Congressman Graves and the speakers in the first panel was, if you're going to work at scale, if you're going to do something significant in the coast, you're going to be bringing together multiple parties, you're going to be bringing together multiple funding sources that you're going to be getting out of these stovepipes. And yet there's this desire for accountability. I'm sure your board of directors wants to know, what did we do with this TNC money? And, each of your states and federal agencies needs to go back to, their individual constituents and say, can we declare victory, we achieve something with our funding source? How do you get around that issue? How do you kind of report back to people who want to know, did they get their return on investment when your success depends on this merging?
So I'm going to make a couple comments. First of all, one of the challenges when you have multi-jurisdictional, multi-agency, public-private, unlike, let's say, single agency decisions, is that it's a bit more difficult on the accountability front because sort of everybody's in charge, and that can sometimes mean no one's in charge. But there is a way beyond that, and that is to the degree that we have collaborative processes that cut across agencies, cut across public-private, the multi-decision makers that are going to jointly have to make investments, and they develop those clear objectives that Holly described and shared goals, and then they all feed those back into their own accountability systems. That is an important part of the picture. But I want to use this question that you just asked about return on investment to pick up some of the conversation from the earlier panel. I want to, and it links to the accountability question as well. First of all, I think sometimes when we talk about return on investment, we can get distracted by an illusion of precision. Whether you are using quantitative or non-quantitative measures, the fact of the matter is that there's a lot of assumptions and judgments. There's judgments about the particulars versus the overall system and proxies that one uses for systems and so forth. So there's an illusion of precision. So I think it is more useful, and I think Holly brought this up, but others alluded to it as well, to think in terms of sort of larger directional thrusts as opposed to particular and precise measured outcomes of the components. So this, you do need outcomes, but those outcomes should have a systems focus. And then the way one is thinking about measuring those outcomes should be far more in terms of trying to look directionally. The other thing I want to say, though, is in thinking about that return on investment issue, a lot of the challenge is in the upfront process of considering just exactly what your outcomes are that you're after. And I think one of the challenges that we've faced in terms of resilience and in terms of Army Corps projects historically and so forth is that there has been, with cost-benefit analysis requirements in the government apparatus, there's been a tendency to only include those things that are easily quantifiable. And I think if we're going to be more successful in the larger systems functionality and directional outcomes that we want, there has to be a much more intentional inclusion of the suite of benefits, including ecosystem functionality, that may not be perfectly quantifiable. But that has to be intentional, and the Corps is moving in that direction, but we're way behind where we need to be. So let me just leave it at that and say, I think there are ways across the accountability issue in a multiplayer context, provided that the decision process is a collective one in which shared goals are developed. But you still then have challenges of what is it exactly are you measuring? And I think we're in peril if we rely on illusions of precision and instead set sort of benchmark directional goals.
Glenn, do you want to comment?
I'm not sure I do, but anyway.
Okay. Well, you've just worked on a lot of multi-stakeholder.
I was, as Lynn was talking, I was trying to think historically, and this might seem a bit rambling. I'll try to be brief. When the nation got in the business of dealing with the 27 floods, and the floods that slightly preceded that and later on, for better or worse, we took a system perspective. We tried to think about the Missouri River. We tried to think about the levees to the south and so forth. And individual projects then came along, not necessarily in some ideal or optimized sequence, but they came along. But the goal was to basically whack the tails off the hydrograph, to basically say, we don't want these floods to come along. So there was a system perspective that was driven by a vision, and individual projects that had to be justified in some sense, but they weren't necessarily precisely against that vision. And so there was this idea of benefit cost analysis and so forth was almost a facade around this getting to this system vision. So now we want to do something different. We need this other vision, and it's something called resiliency, or however you want to look at it. Maybe it's some element of what I described, whatever it is. And until we have a clear national consensus on what that vision looks like for the coasts, individual projects are going to be hard to fit into that. This is just my off the top of the head thought. And so that seems to me to be the first step. And I guess I'm just endorsing what Lynn and actually the first panel said, that we need some better context of what's the big picture, where are we going here? And then I think individual projects will find a home within that in terms of accountability. But right now, if you try to make a case in the accountability world, the OMB, about a particular project, they're still, looking at one narrow slice in one project in one place.
I want to dive in. I concur with that brief historical perspective, but I want to challenge one consideration. As we pivot to resilience, and I completely endorse your point that words matter, and restore does have a retrospective connotation. Resilience is something else. And unless and until we are wholly thinking in terms of resilience, we will not necessarily be thinking of the suite of outcomes and changes that we're looking for. But let me go back to the point about sort of this resilience vision. On the one hand, it is true, unless we have a pivot nationally and in terms of how the Army Corps itself thinks about its agenda, the Army Corps being just one touch point of the contributors to this endeavor. It is true, we will stumble because they have a lot of money, they do projects that may or may not be relevant. But I want to push back against the idea that the real driver is going to be national vision reorientation. I think the reorientation is more bottoms up. And I think it is occurring as we speak. I think when you go to Houston, when you go to Miami, and a four-county or four-mayoral kind of collaboration that's underway, when you go to Ventura County, when you go to the Northeast post-Sandy, what you are seeing is real communities in real places that have experienced the rebuild over multiple episodes of natural disasters with, in some cases, greater frequency. And they're beginning to ask tough questions about, well, wait a minute, do we want to keep doing this? Do we want to keep suffering ourselves? Do we want to spend our own money and contributions in this way? They are also taking a broader vision, and they're saying, well, wait a minute, how can we take a challenge and turn it into an opportunity? And here's where I want to make a significant point. We're focusing a lot on ecosystem functionality, but I think resilience really does have to bring community, environment, and economy together. And so these communities are beginning to ask the questions of how do those all come together? How can we, for example, use nature-based solutions that may, by the way, be better, cheaper, greener, smarter, so we're saving some money. They bring some ecological functionality and benefits, but by the way, they may bring other benefits too in terms of improved fisheries or whatever. And so it's happening bottom up. That introduces the speed question, because obviously when it's bottom up and community by community, that may be kind of slow in some communities and faster others. But I do want to say it's not just about national vision. And probably this will be more prompted bottoms up, because that's where people are who are suffering from poor decision making right now.
Yeah, I entirely agree. The only reason I used the word national, A, I wasn't thinking, but two, there is still this notion that the federal government is somehow going to come to the rescue with dollars, and until we get away from that, also the expectation, there's going to be this tension between bottom up and national vision.
There's so much I'd like to say about that. One is that we have to make, in part of our communication about the value of this work that we're doing, that it has to be in a context that people understand why it's a worthwhile thing to invest in, and where the money comes from then becomes, well, maybe that's a better, maybe it comes from a private, because they understand that there's a reasonable return on that investment of real dollars. One of the things I think that I'd like to kind of go back to, one is, if resiliency becomes part of our center stage of what we're talking about, you're really talking about, say, something like a living shoreline or oyster shell, you have to also think about, if that's one way to look at resilience, you have to, well, how does that thing work? Oftentimes in the past, we say, okay, let's just build a living shoreline without really thinking about, well, what is the functioning going around that supports that living shoreline? So we look at a particular stretch of an estuary or maybe of a barrier island, but not thinking about, well, how's the sand getting there? What about the water quality? How many millions of dollars have been spent on oyster shell planting around the country in all kinds of different places, realizing you're just dumping shell in a place that's going to, in a year from now, it's going to be 3 feet under mud, right? Or the water quality is so poor that it's not sustaining. So I think that the element of yes, we absolutely have to think about the sustainability and of the resilient projects that we do, and the way we have to do that is within this, how that system supports that. Unfortunately, we don't have the resources, even with the billions that we do have, to do every single watershed or every single. And so at some point, there has to be some hard decisions made that say, look, we can do a little bit here and do a little bit there, and nobody's really happy, but nobody's pissed off because everybody's got a share of the pie. Well, that's that Groundhog Day example. I think we're gonna have to make some kind of decisions about that illustrative way of thinking and communicating why those are important to the decision makers and the people who support those and their constituents, of how these things are connected. I use an example, and forgive me for I'm kind of a metaphor kind of guy, and so I think about what we're talking about here is we're creating a stained glass window. You can imagine being in a beautiful building with the sun shining through it and creates this beautiful picture. But when that artist created that thing, all they had was a big pile of glass sitting there in all different colors. And just to kind of imagine that the different funding streams and the different political decisions are, well, that's that color, and NIFWIF's this color, and NERD is that color, and the government, or maybe this is private investment over here. And then collectively over time we build this picture. But if you don't have that in mind, and this is why I think that the importance of outcomes, of what it is, what is it the heck are you trying to do? The old saying is, if you don't know where you're going, anywhere will do. That's unfortunately has guided a lot of our kind of our thinking. And I think there is I agree completely with the folks that have said that. Look, I think the time has changed. We cannot keep thinking and doing things the same way over and over again. And so I think we have opportunity to change. We do have money that's not politically allocated from Congress. We have a lot of people who are interested in how that money is being spent, and a lot of people who are really smart about restoration. So hopefully the dynamic is such that we can use that dynamic tension in a positive way to make some better decisions. Are we going to make some stinky ones? No question about it. But we can't get. We have to keep moving forward and keep pushing that elephant. And I think I'm pretty optimistic that we can do that.
So
can I add? I just thinking about this return on investment thing caused me to raise a few more points, several of which have not yet been made. So in the last panel there was the question, but are there any low-hanging fruit? There are several ways. Now I know economists and investors may have particular.
You gave it away. Now we know the economists.
Return on investment.
I represent
Sorry,
all economists.
I'll look over it, but let me sort of broaden and loosen up the concept a little bit and say, from the standpoint of low-hanging fruit, there are some circumstances where we have some relatively clear goals and where there are different mechanisms to try to achieve those goals. Build this wall, replace that old culvert where all the roads were wiped out in Vermont after Hurricane Irene, or nature-friendly culverts and restore some sea marshes and so forth, whatever. If you have a set of clear goals, there are ways to then, just from an engineering standpoint, evaluate the relative costs of different solution sets and say, gee, my goals are clear, I think I'll do the cheap one. That then, of course, though, does invite a second layer of questions, which is the short-term, long-term cost issue, which we haven't talked about. So one of the issues we faced, the Conservancy in the Northeast, where we, in the wake of Hurricane Irene, and you saw in Vermont, New Hampshire, large numbers of roads damaged, cut off, communities cut off in a couple cases for weeks on end. And a lot of it was due to, old-fashioned culvert structures, and they simply couldn't perform the job. And so we go in and say, you could do these nature-friendly culverts, redesign these, et cetera. By the way, it'll be good for fish, but it'll also be much more resilient in the future. You'll have less road blowout in these big storms. The problem is, of course, the procurement processes would say, what's cheapest now? And in fact, the nature-based culverts sometimes can be more expensive in the front end. And so, asking the return on investment question does involve a timeline issue. But then there's the big problem that we're all struggling with, and that's if you're not clear about your goals, and there's a multiplicity of them, and many of them are not quantifiable. How do you better ensure that you have some kind of a dialogue tableau to introduce those multiple values into the picture and at least get some shared sense of what how you're going to, what suite of goals you're going to pursue, and then at least some sense of directionally how you're going to get them. That's the much more complicated set of questions.
So here's a question that I really didn't think I would get to, but it seems to be percolating under this. So at some level, are we talking about the dreaded term of discount rates? So, that there's this assumption in society, right, that there's this preference for, cheaper now and that we prefer things that happen now versus things that happen in the future, and that a perspective of resilience needs to flip that around, and we need to be privileging the future generations and the longer term spending. I mean, do we have this wrong in our statutes and our setups, how we analyze things?
I am not going to go there, but because it's a technical matter that I think you're asking a philosophical question.
I'm asking a philosophical question.
Not a technical one, actually, so let's not even make it technical. One of my favorite thoughts, I've talked to Denise, she doesn't remember about this, but basically, if you draw a path of a restoration project, say a wetland, right, and it starts real slow, and then it peaks out 30 years from now, but then sustains itself over time without any inputs. That's one model. Then there's another model that says, okay, I can spend a lot of money right now and I can build this thing, and then it goes boom right up to the top and I get immediate wetland benefits, but then it begins to degrade unless I keep pumping in resources, okay? And I don't know that there's an answer to that, but I sure think that we ought to understand that that's what's going on, and that's the trade-off. And I do, and how do you think about that problem? And I think to try to wrap that up in some kind of a notion of the discount rate ought to be 3% or 7% is to totally miss the debate. You should be thinking about are you going to have those resources in 50 years to pump into it? If you are, then maybe you should do it now. And what are they going to cost? And those are the ways we should be talking about that question.
Well, that's
talk on the philosophical issue.
Yeah, philosophically, I guess I have to kind of go back to, having been involved with since in working in the Gulf now, and that right during the spill itself, and again, this is really providing the context for how we make decisions and whether we do things now or later. And one of the things that I think that we have failed to do so far, and that is really to capture the sense of how the community was feeling. And maybe that's saying that little really touchy-feely, but I can remember this is back when I was working for NOAA, and I was doing lots and lots of public hearings, actually kind of being the person that people like to beat up, because you're right there and talking to folks. But the part that, so that's not the part that really matters. The part that I remember, and I think that it's part of whether it's you're sitting in a hurricane like this past one in Texas where it was just raining unbelievably. I'm sure that people sit in those houses and wondering what in the hell is going to happen to me. The water's coming up, or whether it's from a hurricane, or but in this particular incident with the spill, I can remember still talking to some people that they were literally thought that their way of life was over. And in the middle of a crisis like that, I think we tend to think like that. But as time goes on, and you talk about, well, it's been 10 years since since Katrina, and then all of a sudden we had the spill, and then it's going to be 5 years since Sandy, and we start losing that connection to why people cared so much about those things as they were happening. I love the first panel talking about that. We take it's easy to come to a technical thing. Let's build it with the ecosystem approach or systems approach, but to what end? Who are we trying to do all this for? And again, it's those people that were affected by that, or whether they're affected by the floods or by the storm. How do we bring that element into our decision making? And not necessarily in an emotional way, but from the fact is that life is changing. Whether we like it or not, climate is changing. How do we put those decisions about what we do? Maybe the best thing to do with all this money is not do any restoration, do conservation. Just buy land for things to, So I think those are going to be the challenges that we're facing over the next, years in the future.
So I see the big stop sign, but may I make one more comment? Because this invites a thought.
Oh, I thought she was flashing at me.
We hear, we've heard a lot of discussion about the big we. But that sort of begs the question of who is making these decisions and who is involved. And I want to say a word about the integration of science and decision making. There's a tendency to say, here's the problem set, I have my science, here might be the solution if this is the set of goals. But I would suggest that all of the things that we're talking about really involve the perspectives, priorities, preferences, needs, concerns, values of communities. And, fundamentally, the integration of science and decision making in ways that are going to yield durable solutions must rest, to my mind, on collaborative processes, mutual learning. And that mutual learning is not only, say, the science knowledge meeting up with experiential knowledge, but mutual learning in terms of amid a multitude, an infinity of values. Which ones are people most concerned about? Where do they put their priorities, and how do we think about that? And let me just stop there. I think this gets back to my opening comment that I'm sitting in this chair perhaps as a political scientist, and the importance of governance considerations, which fundamentally involve who's at the table, who's helping to decide, what are the mechanisms for robust dialogue, how are shared outcomes deliberated. And of course, the science and technical world can help introduce knowledge relevant to thinking about that, both on the setting of the problem, but also on the solutions. But ultimately, if the values aren't in there, and that's about people, we're not going to have durable solutions.
So let's take that opportunity to kind of broaden this conversation out.
And so I'd like to bring it up to anybody that does studying, because Puerto Rico has an awful lot of assisted housing, and so does Houston. And so there's a great mechanism to study in a very quick environment how we're going to politically make these decisions. So that wasn't a question, that was just a plug. Sorry.
Can I, it's not a question, but I did want to make a comment, which I've been wanting to make. And I think this plays off of that in my judgment, that one of the challenges we have is that our institutions, in terms of this term, even the narratives around words like return on investment, and I got to be careful how I say this, they tend to be tilted toward the well-off. Okay? When you look at how FEMA makes a decision on whether to buy out a house, when you look at the way the Corps decides whether or not something is justified. Now, you can argue that's okay. I just think we ought to acknowledge that there are a lot of folks, because of the way we do the things, it's kind of built into the decision criteria. It's not like it's some conspiracy or something. It's just built into decision criteria that maybe had a rationale in the past. But I do think that as we go forward, there are going to be, we need, and the buzzword is environmental justice. I don't know if that's exactly the right word, because I think it's really more of an analytical problem is how we think about that. And so I think that, I don't know if that's, I know that wasn't a question, but I want to endorse what you said, that we need to be thinking about that.
So I want to actually bring us down to earth. The Conservancy is known as a large conservation organization, but we launched 4 or 5 years ago a cities program, and a cities program focused on resilience, and with a particular focus on disadvantaged communities. And in that context, I'll highlight one in which we're working. It's in the Boston area, and we are working with a really low-income, disadvantaged community, large percentage of public housing, half of the young adult population unemployed. And working with the local governments there has been created what's called an eco-district. And the community itself is defining what resilience is for it. And interestingly, through that process, they have decided that as they look to the future, they want to be a model of, shall we say, greening their community, ecosystem services in their community. They don't exactly use that term. But it goes back to engaging the communities in self-definition. And here's a case where we're doing it in a disadvantaged community with people in public housing and so forth, and with a lot of inspiration in the process.
Yeah, I'm arguing Puerto Rico. Puerto Rico, everybody's going to want to stay. We can give vouchers, we can, and I heard the term relocating communities, which was sort of interesting, but we're talking about relocating families. Mm-hmm. And, they got to go somewhere, and they all can't stay. So Puerto Rico is very different.
Hi, I'm Peter Edwards, NOAA's Coral Reef Conservation Program. I had a former life in NOAA's Habitat Office of Conservation. Just to try and have the panel think about the two words, bring a little bit more optimism into the end of the conversation. Your thoughts about, those two words, declaring and victory. Declaring, in my mind, sounds like, messaging. Are we declaring the right messages to the different communities? So thinking about who are we declaring it to? Are we thinking about changing it depending on audience? And secondly, victory, which is kind of what we spent a lot of time talking about. What does victory success look like? Is it ecosystem function, or is it serving some other need or community, including those who may not be compensated in terms of the what we define the victory as? There are often losers and winners, Pareto optimality, to throw some economics in. Are we compensating those who may not necessarily are winners in these different scenarios?
And if I can just add on to that for a moment before you get to it, that in some level, in many situations, is your victory going to be an outcome that is essentially less bad? So what you're messaging is, this future state that we got to is less bad than this other future state that we would have gotten to in the absence of these actions, but we may not really like this one either. So, got it.
Well, I think that we have a lot of learning. We have a lot of change that we need to think about to really communicate that idea of success, and in the sense that it's really going to be different where you are. And again, talking a little bit about that example of if somebody living in Mobile Bay thinking that, God, I'll never be able to eat another shrimp again, is and how do you how does that person view success versus someone who owns a big company building condos and they want to build on in a beach area? So part of it is what is the context of that message? So I really kind of have to come back to think about what are we really trying to do, and ultimately some people are not going to be happy about it. It's not easy, and it's horrible to get people to have to move, and but we are living at the end of a lot of decisions that have been made in the past, and I think we're going to have to think about where do we really need to go, and it's not going to be easy. So the victory really is, I think, in some ways we're talking about it, but we also are going to have to do something about it, and ultimately, in my little world that I'm living now in the Restore Council, somebody's going to have to sit in front of Congress and say, we used all this money to do what? And and I'm sure they're going to hear a lot of complaining, saying you guys did the wrong things, and that's okay, because that's the way it's going to be, and we know that. But the fact is that if we don't do anything right, and then again, that's all on perspective. I think that the fact is that we have to move forward in a way that focusing on outcomes, not outputs, and thinking about really how are we valuing the things that do we have clear objectives of what we're trying to get to, and if we can say we have achieved to some degree the things that we set out to do, that in a way of success, because that's different than what we've ever the normal process of governments.
So I'm a Pollyanna.
I am too. So. And
therefore, I won't settle for less bad as the definition of success. There's no question there are trade-offs, and we need to be realistic about that. You've described some Puerto Rican tough decisions. There are other very tough decisions. So it would be misleading to pretend that everything is win-win-win. So one needs to recognize those trade-offs, and in doing so, try to understand what set of people or what set of values are not the winners, but then think about whether there's ways to compensate or offset those losses. But I do want to, in a more sort of positive description of victory, return to something I said at the very beginning, and which moves at least me beyond the less bad world. And that is, to me, victory will not be victory unless we have decision processes that give a sense of empowerment to those affected by decisions. And if there's a sense of empowerment to those affected by decisions, That means they are partly involved in those trade-offs. They are partly involved in those discussions about what the offsets or compensations might be for losses that any individual or individual community might face. And so that helps not eliminate the trade-offs, but provide a context of victory in which people feel they had a voice, and that the future that is that we're driving towards reflects their value. Beyond that, I will say again that the system's focus, community, environment, economy, really does present opportunities that transcend how we've made a lot of these decisions in the past, that I think yield not less bad, but actually yield better. But we need to systematically do that.
So I think that I want to endorse what Lynn said. I think that the definition of success or victory is about process as much as it is about outcomes. I think that's basically the point she's making. And if I could be more specific and talk a little bit about the Louisiana master plan, at least from my perspective. Stop laughing, Denise. A couple of things I like about it is I think it does have it has the scientific component, and it does create the framework upon which you can begin a messaging. And there's some problems in the way the messages are. My favorite example is that if you see the headline for the master plan, it says the master plan will prevent this many damages in the future, storm damages. But if you look underneath that, you'll find out, but they're still going up, okay? So, and then it doesn't even talk about nuisance flooding. So I guess the point is, but it does actually talk about it, but some of those aren't getting out, but it creates the platform. So optimistically, I'm saying that we are doing the kind of analysis that ultimately can engage people and to begin to tell sort of the factual story behind that. With regard to permitting, since Congressman Graves brought it up, I think that there are several points, certainly in the 404 process, where you don't have to be hung up. And the problem is not that that's insurmountable. The problem is that people haven't looked enough at it to figure that out. So I don't want to be pessimistic. I think we can get through these things. And Lynn's already alluded to it, but I also think that one of the trade-offs that we face, whether it's perceived or real, is that people believe they bear short-term costs for long-term gain. So if you talk to the fishermen or watermen in Chesapeake, what are they called in Louisiana? The people who go out on the water and catch stuff. If you talk to them, whether they're right or wrong, they say, yeah, someday there'll be a lot of shrimp, but right now that's not where I am, okay? And you have to acknowledge that that's true. And we need to take the notion of, we talk about environmental mitigation all the time. We ought to be talking about economic mitigation too. And we ought to be thinking about, as part of our cost structure, how to bring that kind of idea to the table. So I'm not at all pessimistic, because I think I see lots of places to break through here. It's just a matter of having the process of the discussion to do that. So I don't want to come. If I came across as pessimistic, that was not my intent at all.
I just add one point. I think one thing to add to the whole point of success, and that is we have to learn from as you're moving along and doing this work that we're doing, we have to adaptively manage. I know that can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, but I think that it means that we can't be afraid to make a decision. And if things don't go like we think, we change and move forward. We may start going this direction and end up over here, but at least we're moving forward. And I think that unfortunately, in the past, we tend to, move in a direction and not really invest the resources into being able to tell are we heading in the right direction or not? We're just moving, So there has to be that making that cognitive decision that not only are we going to be willing to change our direction, but we're going to invest in the types of resources that we're going to need to know what direction we're going in. That's part of success.
Maybe time for one short question.
Okay. I wanted to sharpen the groundhog metaphor because Bill Murray.
Introduce who you are?
I'm Bill Werrick, independent consultant, but I've worked with Lynn before, former Corps of Engineers. In Groundhog Day, Bill Murray actually does learn from his experiences. Remember? I mean, the first thing he does is he has short-term benefits. He tries to get Andie MacDowell in bed. And then only at the end of the movie does he find a truer, more sustainable happiness with her. And I think when we talk about solving these kinds of problems, We have an answer, which is the response after a disaster. It's the only time when we are politically able to do anything, but we are barely at Bill Murray's first stage. We're lucky if we can deliver food and shelter people. But the sad thing is that with houses torn down to the ground, with coasts destroyed, that we try to replace what was there before and start the whole cycle all over again. This is the one time where if we had a flood response plan that didn't just bring sandbags and plywood for windows, if we came with a plan for Puerto Rico that was based on the notion that, you know what, someday Puerto Rico is going to get hit by a hurricane and that disaster is going to happen, we could actually do something.
So I think with that, I will thank panel one. I think we can all look forward to a future of continuous focus groups.
My name is Jay Knott. I'm the Executive Vice President and Chief Business Officer of Abt Associates, and it's my challenge to close this event. So we started off asking some tough questions. Congressman Graves started off, he said a lot of things, but I think at the heart of his message was a simple need, which is the need for expedited, common sense driven, collaborative action leading to positive outcomes for people. I think he talked a lot about how you get there, the constraints with regards to political will and legislative obstacles for creating the environment in which those can occur. But I think at the heart of his message was this need and desire to serve the people. He also promised legislative action, which in this environment in and of itself constitutes bold thinking, I think. So I want to give him credit for that. We then moved on to our two panels. The first was about measuring what we're doing. And of course, that really led us almost very quickly into a juxtaposition between measuring what I would call micro data, sort of what's happening on a particular project, versus looking at sort of how projects contribute to a system and the improvement in a system. And so I think when we think about how we conceptualize projects, I think you need to think about how you create a continuum of those things. Because I think, as we all know, no one approves a project without knowing exactly what it's going to achieve. But we also need to think about projects and how they contribute to a portfolio of outcomes. I think a takeaway, big takeaway for me was how, in fact, we think about outcomes. Everyone thinks about and talks about outcomes today and results. I think a sort of a takeaway was really reconceptualizing outcomes as waypoints. Outcomes as waypoints. We're never at the end of the road. We're just farther along on the road. That led us to declaring victory. How we define success? So how do we define the desirable outcomes we need? Who will define them? Who's at the table? We talked about environmental justice, community empowerment, getting more people involved in making decisions about what happens to them in their lives, in their livelihoods. Juxtapositioning the retrospective and the prospective. So we can't go back to Neverland, but most of our laws want us to restore. And what we really want to do is look forward. How do we create some blend where we're serving what people remember, but leading towards what they need to embrace, both in terms of the environment, but also how they interact with that environment. And then finally, that we're all, if outcomes are a waypoint and success is defined more in terms of the process and the system, doesn't that imply continual learning? If outcomes are just another learning point, then we never stop learning. Certainly at Abt Associates for more than 50 years, we really resonated to this need for data-driven, evidence-based learning, which in fact leads to economic well-being and better health for people around the world. our discussion today really incorporated all of those things, all of the values we hold dear, and certainly we welcome all of you for participating in it. So I get to officially declare that this Bold Thinkers Series event on coastal restoration is in fact a victory for the thoughts, the audience that it has assembled, and we want to get you to pledge to continue to engage with us, to engage on the issues, so in fact that we can continue along the road together. So thank you very much.